Right. Good morning, and thank you for everyone joining us here in the room at Makerere. And for those who are joining online, welcome. It's wonderful to join you in the first presentation for, I guess, the second day. I will be chairing the session, A1, which you're in. I'm Esther Martins, and yeah, that's a bit about me. The session is titled Practical Articulations of the Ontology of an African University. We'll be having 4 presenters who will be sharing with us, those who are here in person. A number of them will either be sharing presentations online or speaking to the content that they were going to be sharing. I would like to introduce first our first speaker, who's Abongile Sonkosi, from Rhodes University. She will be speaking to an old academic garment that we must all conform to. Welcome, Asibe. Sorry, Abongile.
Good afternoon, everybody, or just hello. That okay? Okay, thank you so much. First, let me introduce myself. Ndinguzotsho, Undala, Umkhwanazi uBhukula. I'm the granddaughter of uMamKhonebo uBhubhu uDuka namahlathi izithunga zithathu. Ndiyacama gusha ndiyanqula ndithi makube xhosa kube hele ndede ubumnyama kuvela ukhanya. Amagusha. So there's been a change of plan, and the title of my presentation now is Dancing Between Two Worlds. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. So the title of my presentation today is Dancing Between Two Worlds. I like when Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I speak under Ubuntu, which says umntu ngumntu ngabantu. A person is a person through other persons. It's okay, I can do this by myself. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, in doing this presentation today, I wanted to come here and present my great, wonderful study that I've been doing for 4 years and show you how amazing it is and, you know, how top of the range it is. But then I decided that in as much as I've done this research and it's complete and it is amazing, but then there's one part of that research that I didn't share and I was not willing to share with people. And it's the one part that made it what it is today, right? So let me just give you a background of my study. So my study is about counter narratives of theorizing the Black female doctoral candidate, which is done in Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam, and Rhodes University. It is about the experiences of Black female PhD candidates. And it looks at how PhD candidates have multiple intersectional identities and how social power structures affect their doctoral studies, right? And in my study, I use the theoretical framework of African feminism and intersectionality. And I used African feminist methodologies, and that is what I want to talk to you about today. So African feminist methodologies are a way of challenging the existing approaches to knowledge making. So with African feminist methodologies, we aim to focus on the hidden narratives and put her world in the center. Right? So with African feminist methodologies, we change the way we talk about participants, we change the way we talk about positionality, we change the way we talk about data gathering, and we are present in the way we do ethics, right? So in how I did my research, I looked at, rather than seeing participants as people or places that I can extract data from, that I can take knowledge from, I decided to connect with my participants. I decided to see my participants as people that I can build a relationship with. So by using African feminist methodology, it was a way of being present with the people that you do research with, seeing them for who they are, seeing them with the fullness of who they are, right? And in thinking about positionality, it was not just about me saying, I am a Black woman, I am female, I am this and I'm that, but it was also being aware of the space that I'm in. It was also being aware of the privilege that I might have, or in the ways that I could be oppressed in that space, or in everything that I was in that space, but to be present, to be aware, to negotiate, to challenge those, my positionality, to challenge those oppressions, to challenge those privileges in that space. So it was very useful for me to deal with research like that. It was for me to reflect before I went into the research space, but also to reflect during the research process onto how am I doing this? How am I being present? Because when I talk about being an academic, when I talk about research, it is about not just coming into the space as a mind, it is not just coming into the space as a body, but it is also about coming into the space as a spiritual person, bringing your spirituality, bringing everything that is you, and allowing people to exist, giving people permission to exist as they are. Right? And then even when we talk about data gathering, it's not just about the ways that are accepted, the ways that are valorized, the ways that have been normalized, the ways that people have been doing research, but it is also not just thinking outside the box, but destroying the box and just thinking, allowing ourselves to be in the process of research, using dreams to collect data, using silences to collect data, using poems, using storytelling. I used photo voice, I used interviews, but in the ways that are present, in the ways that make me present in the space, and ways that make my participants present in that space, right? And in talking about ethics, then I did not just deal with ethics in the ways that, okay, it's just a paper, it's just a form that I have to sign, but then it was more than that. It was also, it was always about being aware, how can I be receptive to my participants? How can I be present for them? What decisions am I supposed to make in this process? Right? That is what African feminist methodologies is about, right? I was just giving you an idea of what it is. And then, so with my research, I had to offer a powerful approach that allows us to go beyond what is normalized, as I said, beyond what is valorized in the academic space. So in planning my research, I had to use the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is captured in Umntu ngumntu ngabantu. A person a person becomes human through their connection with people, and that is what research should be in an Afrocentric university, right? So for me to be able to capture this, I had to use something called ukapa, to accompany, to be accompanied, to allow yourself to be accompanied by someone else. So as a researcher, sometimes you think you're walking alone. You think you're only there to just come take knowledge from people and leave, but it is not about that. It is about accompanying these people in their stories, being accompanied by them in your research process, right? But it's also deeper than that, because for me, it was not just about being accompanied by my participants or the people that I was doing research with, but it was also about saying we are accompanied by our ancestors when we do research. Some of us come in this space because we are led. We come into this space because we are guided by ancestors. So that is why I did this research, and that is why some of my participants did this research. So it was for me to say, Ukapa was about me saying, I am giving you permission to exist. I'm giving myself permission to exist in this space as an indigenous researcher, as a spiritual person in the academic space. So I would like to give you then a few examples of what happened in my study and how these things came up and how spirituality came up, because it's a big thing in an Afrocentric university. If we're not bringing in spirituality in an Afrocentric university, then we have not done anything, right? So I will start with the story of Ugogo Nkanyezi. That's what I named her. I named her Gogo Nkanyezi. And when the interview started, I sat down with her, and immediately when I sat down, I could sense that she was not alone in the room. It was the two of us, but we were not alone. I had to ask her for permission. Gogo, can I have permission to talk to you? Gogo Nkanyezi, can I have permission to speak to you and to your ancestors? And I had to wait for her to grant the permission, because Inkundla was hers, the court was hers, and her ancestors' court. And I understood that her ancestors were very powerful beings. So I had to respect that. And as Gogo Nkanyezi took me through her research, I understood that she had not given herself permission to exist in that space, or permission to be seen in that space. As powerful as her research was, but she never gave herself permission to be seen, to be known for who she is. She tells me that as I was doing this research, I ducked and I dived, because I was trying so much for them not to see me, not to find out who I am. And the powerful part about her research is that she says, I was guided. I had to be guided by my ancestors. I had to let myself be present, my ancestors to be present, and to walk with me in this process. At the end of her research, she ended up using songs to analyze her findings, or to interpret her findings. She said, the research that I am doing is about racism, and racism in South Africa is such it's such a horrible thing that still exists. So if you are going to talk about racism, you need to bring it in a way that people are going to be comfortable in. So in the way that she wrote her findings, it was that she wrote findings that she used songs, and she said, I want to sing these songs back to them. I want them to listen to these songs and to be healed. So the decolonial process is a process of love, is a process of healing. So that is what I loved about her. And to say that I have to hide myself, I have to duck and dive, it means that as indigenous people, as spiritual people, we're still not safe in academia. We're still not existing as we should. And I take the story of Yandiswa, right? These are my participants. These are people that I've dealt with. I take the story of Yandiswa, and which is connected to me, because I was also Nkanyezi, who was ducking and diving, more like silencing myself, hiding. And this is the first time I'm talking about the way that I did my research in public, because it was something that I thought that, you know what, I'm just going to do research and produce the document. I'm not going to tell them how I did my research and the things that were connected to this research, because it felt like a space that does not accept me for who I am. It felt like a space that does not allow me to be myself. So with Yandiswa, every time I came into an interview, I came, and as I was interviewing participants, their ancestors would talk. I'm busy listening to you, you're telling me your story, but at the same time, your ancestor is telling me what they want you to know. This is where the ethics comes in, that I had to, after finishing the interview, I had to say then, are you okay with, do you know African spirituality? Are you okay with me conveying a message to you from your ancestors? And if the person is okay with me conveying a message, then I would do that. So that was not in the form, in the ethics form, it's not included there, but then it is me negotiating, challenging the ways we are told to do research, but to bring a different way of doing research that is aware, that makes us aware of who we are. I sat with Yandiswa and I told her that some of the things I cannot share, but because of ethics. So I told her that this is what your ancestors are saying, and this is how your journey is going in this research process. So allow me to tell you what they want you to do in order for you to get out of this process. And I told her about what she needed to do. And today I can tell you that Yandiswa is graduated. Do you understand? So now, as we do this research, we need to ask ourselves, how much of myself do I have to leave outside in order to become a doctor? How much of myself do I have to sacrifice? How much of myself do I have to erase so that I can assimilate into this space, so that I can be accepted as this doctor, right? So, which is why for me, it was really important then to interrogate what the research process was like for me, what came up for me. So even with Miranda, I had to tell her that your father says that you are doing well. Do not worry that and think that this is not where you are supposed to be. You are doing well. Even with Isabel, people are trying to hide that. Within the interview, I was asking, who guides you, who supports you in your research? And Isabel was like, my grandmother, she guides me. So we need to understand and we need to be cognizant of the ways of being that are not being accepted into the university, the ways of being that are not being recognized. And if we want to, I repeat this, if we want to answer this question, then where does spirituality fit into that? How far are we willing to go? Because I even said to myself that deep down, I know that when I come into this space, I'm very ancient, I'm very old, I carry knowledge that is even beyond me. So how far is the academic space willing to accommodate that kind of knowledge? Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What we will do, and I should have started off with this, is that the format we'll take is that every presenter will come up and share, and then at the end we'll have a panel discussion with a Q&A. So if you can, whether you're online or in person here, just hold on to your questions, and then we'll start engaging in that way after all the presenters are presented. So thank you so much, Abungile, for a wonderful presentation. I think the notion or the concept of ukukapa, is a beautiful and wonderful notion. And just even considering doing a PhD or becoming a doctor, and what does that mean for you to not leave yourself when you walk into those doors or into the campus, to bring yourself fully to the study itself is beautiful to consider. So thank you so much for that. We will be moving on to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Zimi Sigenu, who will be joining us. She's from the Human Sciences Research Council. She'll be speaking on bridging past and present, Roba's great debate, and the pursuit of an Afrocentric university. Zimi, if you may join us.
Hi, everyone. Before I begin, I just want to say Famaku to Asipe. I feel very grounded after you spoke, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So I am Zimingwana Phakade Sigenu. I'm working as a researcher at the HSRC, and I will just dive straight into it. So to start us off, I just want to say that we have been here before. So according to literature and everyone that has been speaking in this conference and in other conferences and spaces that we have frequented, we have engaged on decolonization, and we know that African scholars and scholars in the global South have been engaging with decolonization since the 1960s. And part of this has been the interrogation of the academy's dependence from the South on the Northern Academy. This has included challenging the inclusion of voices from the South in constructing disciplinary canons. And this decolonization project has included engaging with how colonialism and imperialism has contributed to the current economic, social, political, and political condition in Africa. And even though the 1960s are highlighted as an important turning point, especially for Africa, the conversation I want to have today is that this has been happening even beyond the 1960s. It's been happening even outside of the academy, in communities, in our African communities. It's been conversations that have been had by our grandmothers and great-grandmothers, important people that would not ideally be recognized in the academy today have been discoursing on the subjects that we are talking about during this conference and in lots of other engagements. And so decolonization and Africanization are not, they may be used today, but conversations that are centered around the subject stretch very far into our history. And so today I'm going to be talking about a text that I came across in 2018 when I was starting my master's degree, which is called Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo, and this is written by William Wellington Gqoba. Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo is isiXhosa, and when you translate it to English, it means the great discussion on education, or the great discussion on the great debate on education. So towards the late 1800s, there were key figures in the isiXhosa speaking sociolinguistic group that emerged. And amongst them were the earliest Black intellectuals in South Africa. And these people were builders, and they were transmitters of intellectual, moral, and political infrastructure. At the end, or at the turn of the 19th century and 20th century, or what would be the end, towards the end of the 1800s, beginning 1900s, these figures produced commentary in newspapers, mostly in newspapers, and they also consciously made a decision to write in isiXhosa, an indigenous language. They covered issues that included history, politics, beliefs, values, culture. They wrote about the socio-political state of the country at the time, specifically commenting on colonial rule and the cultural prejudices of the missionaries over the indigenous culture and social practices. They also wrote about the value of Western education and practices, while at the same time, they pondered over the effects of this education on the communities, on indigenous practices, on indigenous knowledge, and how these were affecting the social fabric of their communities, and how it was affecting what had kept the functioning of these communities so intact. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have been here before. These conversations are not new. So the person whose text I'm going to be talking about is William Wellington Gqoba. He is the writer of Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo, or the Great Discussion on Education. He forms part of this group that I just described, and he had a career in teaching. He was a preacher, he was a translator. Later on in his life, he taught at Lovedale and became the editor of an isiXhosa newspaper, one of the early isiXhosa newspapers, Gidimi Samaxhosa. And so in his writing, you can observe his analysis and reflection on the relationship between his heritage, the fact that he is Umxhosa, and the interaction or intersection of that with European philosophy and his identity as this new modern educated individual. In his poetry, he reflects on discussions about modernity, Christianity, and education in relation with being African. As his writings reflect the contradiction he himself experiences as a result of his sociocultural background of being educated, of being Christian, and also living around and still being this man, Ongumxhosa. And you can observe in his writing the attempt to include an African worldview as a lens to critically engage with modernity, or the modernity that the society was encountering at the time, and how this was influencing the social and political as well as economic order. So Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo, or the Great Discussion, is a text that he wrote in the late 1800s. It is an exploration of the impact of Western education on Xhosa society. The text takes the form of a debate or a discussion. It features different characters who act as vessels for various viewpoints. It creates an exploration of how Western education was impacting and transforming society. The characters in Qoba's text collectively create a microcosm of what isiXhosa society looked like and the discussions that were happening at that time. And so included in the various viewpoints of some of the characters are voices that are acting as the voice of tradition, firstly, that articulate and defend traditional values and knowledge systems. There are voices in the discussion that talk about the transformation of education, that transformation that education has brought to them, the elevation that has happened in their lives, the reshaping of society in a way that is European, as opposed to the traditional societies that they at the time had a view that they were of the dark ages in a sense. But at the same time, there is this, in the viewpoints that come across, there's this intention or this attempt to bridge the gap between the old and the new, suggesting a need to integrate the system and trying to make sense of this new social order that is unraveling. And even within those voices, there are some that serve as cautionary figures who provide warnings of the potential negative consequences of abandoning the traditional ways of life and uncritically adopting new systems. So ultimately, within this text, participants share stories of how education has affected them. They debate the merits of traditional versus modern knowledge, and they grapple with the broader implications of educational change for their society. Some praise the opportunities that have been brought by the Europeans through education, while the others lament about the loss of traditional knowledge and values. In the discussion, you can see that the community is in transition. It's a community that is trying to make sense of the changes that are happening, and as a result of colonialism and modernization. And the debate touches on practical concerns like access to opportunities, economic opportunities, as well as deeper philosophical questions about identity, about knowledge, and about the future of society. And so, as I said earlier, again, we definitely have been here before. So Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo provides a lot of food for thought, but I want to zoom in on one aspect of the text that has a term that is used quite a lot. So Qoba uses a concept of ikhethe, which refers in English, can be understood as discrimination, discriminatory treatment, or unequal access. The concept of ikhethe emerges as a central theme in the paper, highlighting issues of discrimination, unequal access, and systemic inequalities in education and society. The term is used in various contexts, and in all these contexts, it sheds a light on the different aspects of inequality in the context of colonial education. There's a point that arises from the text about the fact that there's an unequal access to education provision, and something that is highlighted deeply is the issue of language that acts as a barrier and sort of creates boundaries in terms of access points and the type of knowledge that people can access, because there are certain languages that are used within colonial education that is being implemented in the society that indigenous people do not know. There's also a view about professional opportunities. So Ikete is used in relation to the limited job prospects for educated Black professionals, suggesting that even though they were going through this education system, but then at the end of it, they were experiencing systematic barriers in entering the labor market. There's also views about when you enter the labor market, the text highlights the disparities between Black professionals and their European counterparts, indicating economic ikete, where there is one of the characters highlights that our children went to school, to the same schools as the children of white people, but now in the jobs that they are doing, they are getting less of an income than them. And in some instances, the children of white people have not even gotten the education that our children have, but they are above our children. And another view that the Ikete reflects is societal status. So while education has provided some Black individuals within that society, within that space of Amaxhosa, within the community of Amaxhosa that Ugoba is speaking about, there are Black individuals whose statuses have been elevated, but also this has created new forms of stratification and inequality within the society. And so this idea of Ikete speaks to tensions between gratitude for education or colonial education, but also a critique of it. There's also this thing of individual success versus the collective progress of the community. There are tensions between assimilating to this new system, but also resistance, especially in terms of cultural identity and holding on to values and forms of traditional knowledge that is viewed as beneficial. And so the concept of Ikete as used by Goba in this text provides a lens through which to examine the role of African universities in addressing social justice and inequality. It highlights the need for a more holistic approach that goes beyond merely providing access to education. African universities need to strive to be transformative in a way that addresses inequalities, promotes critical thinking, but also fosters economic empowerment. And so what does this mean for us? When I was reading this text, I felt that there are implications that this text highlights that we can consider as we are thinking about African universities and their relationship with social justice, or African universities as a vessel for social justice. So what comes across for me that is highlighted is the importance of African universities addressing historical inequalities. And this means that African universities need to grapple with the historical legacies of unequal education unequal access to education. And this needs to involve not just providing access, but also addressing aspects of education that perpetuate inequalities. there is the factor of economic empowerment. The discussion of income disparities in the context of this text points to the role of universities in economic empowerment. And something that I haven't experienced a lot in these conversations about decolonizing and Africanizing is how that translates to the general society, because we are here, we are discoursing about decolonizing these institutions and the classroom and paradigms and whatnot, but then we are only a few. But what happens to the general public or the general communities that we come from? Can the decolonization that we are speaking about and the Africanization that we are speaking about lead or lead to the dismantling of barriers, not just epistemologically, but also in terms of living? How in practical terms, how can decolonization make sense, Africanization make sense to someone who does not have a higher education qualification or a master's or a PhD? So how do we translate these conversations to a space where we are affecting inequality, not just within the university, but in the communities that surround the university, in a way that is tangible and in a way that is meaningful? I'm going to skip through a bit because my time is running out. But basically, as I'm wrapping out, what I wanted to do with this presentation was to show or provide a bridge between historical perspectives on education and the contemporary challenges in African higher education that we are thinking about today. And engaging with historical texts like Qoba's can provide valuable insights for current efforts to decolonize and create more equitable educational systems. And Ingxoxo Enkulu Ngemfundo, which was penned over a century ago, I think resonates deeply with the issues that we are thinking about, the challenges that we are hoping to address, even with our own lived experiences, especially as Black scholars. And so this demonstrates for me the enduring relevance of historical African intellectual discourse to current efforts in developing Afrocentric universities and addressing systematic inequalities in education. The insights that I've gained, and I hope that you have also gotten the message about in this presentation, for me, show that the historical text or even the archive, whether it's a formal one or whether it's an archives within our communities in the form of our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, our ancestors, offers a compelling source and is very relevant to the African intellectual project. And it is relevant in shaping the future of education on the continent. And we need to engage with it on a deeper level. Yes. I think I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zimi. That was really wonderful to kind of, and I love that you started off that we've been here before. History repeats itself unless we kind of stop it or interject. And that notion of ikete, that discrimination and unequal access just keeps perpetuating itself. So that gratitude for colonial education, but being able to balance it with the critique of it is a beautiful, something to kind of chew on and think and consider. But sometimes the noise comes from inside the house and it's not outside there trying to get in. So up next, we're going to go to Pedro Mzileni from the University of Zululand. He will be speaking on the Afrocentric University attempt from the womb of imperialism. And I think this ties in quite beautifully that the keynote speaker had mentioned something about the African university being midwifed by a colonial institution. And that kind of stuck with me. So welcome, Pedro.
Good morning, colleagues and friends. My name is Dr. Pedro Mzileni. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Zululand in the Department of Sociology. And forgive me if I keep grinding my throat. I'm recovering from a flu. So the title of my talk is the Afrocentric University Attempt from the Womb of Imperialism. Let me clarify the concept quickly. By womb of imperialism, I'm referring to the fact that we already have a continent that was under colonial rule. And part of colonial rule was to build colonial universities. And there was resistance against colonial rule in armed popular mass struggles for liberation. So the process of now building African universities, or rather Afrocentric universities, it will have to be work that is done from the foundations of colonial rule. So the Afrocentric university that we're building post-colonial rule will come from the womb of imperialism that we resisted. And we are still on the way to defeat completely. So for those who come from the Marxist school of thought, will revoke the saying by Marx that says, men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. In other words, the Afrocentric university that we're trying to build will definitely have to come from the womb of imperialism that we are trying to resist and defeat at the moment. Now, coming to my second point, I talk about this Afrocentric university by first highlighting the imperial university we currently have. Obviously, by referring to the imperial university, many people have different grammars in different locations and different regions around the continent and around the global south to refer to it. If you come to Uganda, they will call it the Western University. If you go to Southern Africa, they will call it the Colonial University. If you go to Northern Africa, they would call it maybe the Imperial University. Different grammars, but who are all referring to the same problem, the same enemy that we're dealing with. On my side, I interpret the Imperial University from my existential reality. As a Black South African, an African racialized Black in Southern Africa, who has lived under late colonial apartheid rule, that's a period I was born, and who went through colonial imperial institutions of knowledge, including the university. How did that feel to me? And what has it played as a role in the production of knowledge that I do at the moment? In other words, Maboho More in 2008 speaks to us about what is called existential philosophy, which is a notion that says that Africans are capable of thought. Africans are philosophers. The fact that Africans produce poetry, they produce literature, they produce religious doctrines, they lead political struggles. It therefore means they are therefore capable of thought, because those things do not emerge out of thin air. Those things are first conceptualized as ideas, as thought, before they are carried out into political struggle, as political action. But for Black people in South Africa, the process of thought takes place intertextually. In other words, as you think and philosophize, you are also involved in political struggle at the same time, right? Because of your existential reality of being a colonial subject. So in other words, Miriam Makeba as an artist, you can't remove her from the political struggle that she was also encountering as a Black woman artist under colonial apartheid rule. So in the same bracket as Beyonce, she's an artist, but you can't only look at her as an artist because of her Black existential reality in colonial South Africa. She is also forced to be a political activist at the same time, right? So therefore, in trying to emphasize the fact that Black people in South Africa are philosophers, they are capable of thought, we also have to wrestle with the division of disciplines in the Western imperial university that tends to lock African thinkers and their knowledge production only in political activism and biological and biographical coverage. Let me explain quickly what do I mean. When you speak to South Africans about Nelson Mandela, for an example, one thing they know about him is that he was a political prisoner from Robben Island. And then magically, he became president in 1994. The story begins there and it ends there. In other words, the dominant understanding about Mandela is biographical, or he's understood as a political activist only. But when you begin to ask people, what was Mandela's thought? What were his ideas? What were his philosophies? What are the top 5 writings by Mandela do you know? Right? That understanding of Mandela as a philosopher disappeared. It disappears in the division of disciplines logic of the Western university, because in a Western university, you must belong somewhere and not belong elsewhere. You can't be everything at the same time. You must belong in a particular department. Joy, the research you do is in anthropology, and that's it. Joy can't be a philosopher. Joy can't stretch the borders of language. Joy can't think sociologically. In fact, the anthropology that Joy does has no history. It's only anthropological. So the Western University is a terrain of killing the diverse capabilities that Africans are capable of in the terrain of thought and being philosophers. And this is not an accident, colleagues, because colonialism invented this logic, because in colonial logic, thought and philosophy are things that are brought to Africa. It's not things that Africa inherently has because it's a civilization of people. So the people who theorize and who philosophize are people from the north. And philosophy and thought are things that therefore must be brought into Africa. That type of logic is still dominant today. Therefore, being Black in the world, being Black in the southern tip of Africa, produces experiences of life that also make you live and think according to your existential experience and also in your process of producing knowledge. Now, coming close to me personally before I then move to my last 2 points. So I'm born in South Africa towards the end of apartheid colonial rule. For sure, all of you in this room are all aware that South Africa, out of all the 55, 56 member states we have in the continent, South Africa was the last one to obtain independence. Ghana, Uganda, Algeria, Sierra Leone, Zambia, they were much earlier. But as Mozambique was obtaining its independence in 1975, we are still under colonial rule in South Africa, and Biko is still alive at that time. As recent as 1990, when Namibia was obtaining independence, we are still under colonial rule at that time, until 1994. So in other words, concepts of globalization, neoliberalism, neocolonialism, are concepts that are still fresh and confusing in South Africa because our independence was only obtained 5 minutes ago. We're still grappling with those questions, right? Now, because colonization in Southern Africa entailed land dispossession, massacres and mass killings, the most dominant form of resistance, therefore, in Southern Africa was the armed struggle, right? So the Southern African region is a terrain of revolutionary violence. We took arms to kill settlers head on because they were doing violence on our people that we had to resist. Now, I am born in that context. I am born during a period when the armed struggle now was taking foot much stronger because independence was right at the door. As late as 1992, in the region where I'm born, there's something called a Bisho massacre, where white people, together with Black elites, took up arms to kill Black people who were resisting in the area where I come from. And we also took arms to kill back the enemy. I am born during that period of the Bisho massacre. So armed resistance as a lived experience, but also as an existential philosophy, those are things that are very recent in Southern Africa. Therefore, being born under those conditions and being born by Black cheap laborers, because South Africa's colonization, similarly to Uganda, similarly to Nigeria, similarly to Ghana, it was a process of direct rule and also a process of indirect rule. Now, if I were to invoke the work of Mahmoud Mamdani from this university, direct rule, essentially, it's about creating Black elites within the colonized who will be representatives of the white colonizer and who will go around representing the agenda of colonization amongst Black people, essentially giving Black people sleeping tablets so that they don't resist against colonial rule. So indirect rule is the creation of these Black elites. So in South Africa, indirect rule involved the creation of homelands where Black people, after their land was dispossessed, they were pushed into small areas that had no means of life called homelands. And in the homeland, it's where also Black people lived as cheap laborers. Because the only way for you to exit the homeland and come into South Africa, which is white South Africa, you were only allowed in for purposes of being a cheap laborer. So in other words, the process of colonization and the process of land dispossession was actually the creation of Black people as cheap laborers, because by land being taken away from you, it means therefore all means of life, you've been cut off out of them. So the only way for you to live when you are Black and colonized is to submit yourself to exploitation as cheap labor. So I'm born in that context, and the only direction of progress being offered was to go and be a student in the settler imperial university, to get a qualification in the imperial society, and try to be part of the Black elite under indirect rule in order to have the means of life. Now, at the time, as I became a student, I began to theorize, to write, and also to apply thought to what I was experiencing, using the language I had at the time. So the first two publications you see there were in my early career academic journey, where I tried to understand this animal called the Imperial University. Here we are as Black young students enrolled in an imperial university, which is a university, which is a European white university, essentially planted into South Africa. Going there as a Black person, you face layers and layers and layers of exclusionary forces that do not make you feel part of the university. Exclusion in material terms, you don't fit into the city and the economy where the university is. Epistemically, the knowledge in the classroom is teaching you to hate your own people and to hate the community where you come from. Even in terms of culture, the culture of the place. When you come into the university and you are Black, you are essentially being told that you are no longer part of Black people's problems. That you are a better Black person than those you've left behind, right? So that is the poison of the Imperial University. That's what it does, because university is only 10% about knowledge and skills. But 90% of the agenda of the university is to introduce a particular culture in you, right? And by culture, I'm not referring to dancing and playing the drum and the samba. That is colonial rubbish of how white people look at us. Culture, I'm referring to the philosophies of thought, the tools you use to interpret your reality. That is culture. So in the indigenous people of Uganda, how they understand what is human, it is interpreted and defined according to the tools of their language and culture. Therefore, in the African context, in the Afrocentric context, culture and language are philosophies. They are not detached or separate cheap entities that are dismembered from each other. Knowledge, language, and culture are all intertwined tools of thought and creating philosophy. I think I'm left with 3 minutes, right? Okay. Let me then wrap up so that we can have a discussion. I will come back to talk about the other items during the question and answer session. So what is this Afrocentric university option, therefore? What must we now do? to deliver an Afrocentric university? Firstly, I argue in a chapter that is upcoming, that I've written, that Afrocentric knowledge is thought and practice rooted in the cultural resemblance and the human interests of African people as conducive members of the human family. So when we talk about Africa, we're talking about the world. When we talk about the world, we're talking about Africa. Africa is part of the world. Africa is in the world. So an Afrocentric university is the one that will center Africa and its people and their cultural interests as conducive members of the entire human family. Two, Simpiwe Sesanti provides an option as well. He says, the Afrocentric university will be the one that centers the Africans as agents of historical and social experiences capable of thought, rather than objects of marginal European gaze who worship foreign recognition. There's this whole notion of quality standards, internationalization, ratings. In other words, how can you in Uganda write something that will be accepted in the French, Portuguese, and English prestige? So in other words, it is only quality and legitimate if in London they can understand what you're doing. If they don't understand what you're doing, then it is not knowledge. The Afrocentric university has to dismantle that notion of wanting to appease foreign recognition. My last 2 points. Zinema Kubane critiques academics. He says academics are part of the class project. Once you become an academic in Uganda, you fall part of a different class bracket. You become part of those who are privileged. And if you are privileged, the function of the privilege, which is the creation of the indirect rule class, is for them to perpetuate and continue the system for them to continue earning and survive. So there's no interest to dismantle the system that essentially creates them. In other words, you might have defeated the colonizer, but if you keep the market economy of your nation state intact, then you still have work to do. Because the market forces are still going to perpetuate old colonial relations, using you now as a black face of the project. So defeating the colonizer is the first step, but the ultimate victory is defeating the capitalist market economy that is currently funding these universities to keep them European and Western. So when academics theorize, I think they must also begin to theorize about how can academics and the products that they produce take over the nation state politically in order to drive an alternative Afrocentric university as a common mission of the nation state. Because at the moment we seem to be sitting and begging those in power who come and give keynotes here that, okay, thank you for the keynote, but please change the Afrocentric university. It's like we're donating the responsibility to them. Instead of us reviving mass struggles, teaching towards mass struggles that will run popular struggles to take over the nation state and its economy to drive a different economy that will fund a direction to an Afrocentric university and negate this Western rubbish that is currently being perpetuated by the existing market economy and the nation state. Lastly, all these things I'm mentioning will be impossible without firstly dismantling what I call bibliometric coloniality. Bibliometric coloniality refers to the colonial economies of knowledge publishing. When your knowledge is published, who is the publisher and where do they come from? And what economic networks are they using to distribute the knowledge that you have written? In other words, when you are an academic and you are writing, who are you writing for? Are the people who are paying you in the university the ones that you are writing for? Are they the ones reading your work? Or are you just publishing for your 19 peers in the ivory tower who have absolutely no knowledge about the communities and the people you're talking about? So this whole dependence on the French, Portuguese, and English prestige and its publishing networks is actually killing Africa. It's killing African knowledges. It's killing African thought. It's killing our connection between us and our communities that we're supposed to work with. Therefore, building a uniquely African knowledge index will be the beginning to achieve that struggle. And I've written that work. I've produced evidence of European funding machines that are perpetuated by African governments and African universities to keep colonial knowledge in order using our own decisions today, including decolonial scholars. So bibliometric coloniality in South Africa, critical review of indexes of accredited journals is a paper that is out on the Education as Change journal. I've written it with Savo Heleta, where we interrogate this question with actual evidence. And we also provide options of what needs to be done to achieve an Afrocentric university. Let me pause there, colleagues. Thank you so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it. Nkosi kakhulu.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro. I think you've given us quite a number of nuggets to ponder on, whether it's the last point about biometric coloniality, or the notion that maybe the imperialists must come, they must do the work, and not defaulting to us, because that keeps us busy. We're not able to sit and do and think about other things. Meanwhile, we hear about coloniality, decoloniality, Afrocentrism, and they're out there thinking about sustainability, 4IR innovation, and all that kind of stuff. So next up, we have Joy Owen, who is from the University of the Free State. She'll be speaking to The Culture Isn't Ready, narrating emergent realities in an African university. Over to you, Joy. I will set up the presentation quickly.
Hello, everybody. The three speakers ahead of us have actually given us quite a bit to think about. And before I start my presentation, I'm probably thinking about the ways in which our positionality within the academy, but also the intersectional externalized identification creates particular kinds of realities. And so if we don't pay attention to what we refer to as hierarchization, so the idea that we have to keep saying, I'm a lecturer, I'm a senior lecturer, I'm associate prof, I'm prof. The fact that we ignore that we do that leads to a particular blindness, I think, right? Because it implies that we speak from very different positions and that we've been in the academy for an extended period of time. So this particular paper, I've been in 3 higher education institutions in South Africa. And Pedro talks about being born in, I'm assuming now, 1992, ne? Yeah. And my first year at university as a student at UCT was in 1993, which then means, of course, that I was raised within that apartheid period. Wasn't coming to an end, it was burning, yeah? And I say that because I need you to understand that this idea of colored people and the creation of a colored identity and ethnicity within and during apartheid has long shadows. And I'm currently busy with the second monograph. And it, in some ways, brings me closer to my mom. So Abungile, it's very interesting because every time I enter the space to write about my mother, to situate a very ordinary apolitical woman, I sit with her. Yeah. So she passed in December of last year, and it's been very strange to come and find her on the page. Because in my academic experience, my mother understood my work, but also didn't. Especially when I often said to her, okay, just checking what my kid is saying there. Especially when she would say, are you coming home for Christmas? Are you coming home for Easter? And I'd say to her, no. And she'd say, why? And I'd say, work. Work was always the reason not to go back. So did she understand? I don't think so. And so it's strange now in writing the second book to have her with me and to hear her say to me, I finally understand what you've been doing. And it's okay that I didn't know before. Yeah. So I felt that link very, very closely when you were talking about your experiences as a PhD. Okay. So let me start us off here, okay, while Jen is working on the power there. So in preparation for Mom's book, and I call it Mom's book, I picked up reading, or I picked up Colored, How Classification Became Culture, a text written by Dooms and Chutel in preparation for this book. It offers deep moments for reflection on my mother's life and my own experiences as an externally identified colored woman in the South African Academy. The sentence that you will see in front of you soon reads as follows. Colored communities are fragile because they hold in plain sight unattended and unacknowledged brokenness, broken families and wounded people, untold stories and untold pain. To restore a people's humanity is to affirm their humanity rather than their race. This particular sentence resonates, but it also leads to an unintended internal recoil. For my mother, being colored and so designated by the South African apartheid state wasn't problematic. She'd often say, my ma was German and my pa was slumps. My mother was German and my father was Muslim. Unlike me, she accepted that the combination of her lineage supported the racial designation, which to her was about culture, not race. So apolitical, I saw my mother as apolitical. She provided no direct teaching as to the ways in which racial capitalism situated her and her family within the South African landscape. However, her struggles to survive beyond the limitations of her intersectional identity supported my complex understanding of racialization in South Africa and the very real need to interrogate the idea of culture, as supported, unfortunately, by anthropologists in South Africa. So it's quite strange that, I became an anthropologist and only became aware of this history when I went in search of it. Yeah. And so now I'm at the point where I teach it to my students so that they understand that even though we have issues with anthropology, there's also value within it. But what exactly is that value? Okay. So I want to tell you one or two things. Jen, I'm going to grab you quickly. Okay, there we go. So using my experience at the University of the Free State, the third institution that I'm at now, as an autobiographical case study, I engage the ways in which transgression and disruption of the natural academic order through the body underscores the system's inability to hold its center. While these transgressions and disruptions are episodic, rather than sustained at length, the academic soil continues to be ruptured and prepared for different seeds to grow and flourish. Like my son who continues to grow, you've seen him with me over the past day. The UFS space is stretching and contracting at odds with itself at times, as those within its halls agitate for more than the pristine, masculine, and rational colonial creation of yore. So this is my initial entry into the UFS, and I refer to it as the honeymoon. Those of you who are married, you will know what this experience is like. So I tried to ascertain the openness to having a baby in office, and so write an email to the then acting dean. The response is lukewarm, inviting me to talk about the matter in person once I've arrived. So I don't know her. I'm a new member of staff, newly appointed as the academic head of department, the first Black inclusive woman. Very strange, eh? Anyway. And I'm asking her if I can bring my baby with me, who at this point is 4 or 5 months old. Okay, so I am what my doctor referred to as a geriatric mother. And so he came late in my academic life, yeah? And so I'm thinking there's nothing wrong with asking if he can come with me, because I don't have a network of care. I'm completely new to Bloemfontein. I don't know anyone. I don't know the daycares, etc. Okay. So I ask if I can start a week later rather than the 2nd of January. And I'm told by HR that I haven't secured any leave since I'm new. Leave will only take into effect after my first month of employment, and then I would have earned 3 days. So I go, so what do I do with my son? No response. So what do? I bring him with me, right? The building is empty, but for one of my colleagues in the department who has started preparation early. During the first few months, my departmental colleagues are supportive of my son's presence. I just need to make this up, okay. And we work around his presence and his random tears. Everyone, including staff and students, hold him, hug him, play with him, greet him. And I'm astonished when colleagues from other departments on the same floor come and visit. Not me, him. The presence of a little one changes the emotional contours of the space. And over a few weeks, the department is not only the anthropology department. It becomes an approximation of a new intellectual and academic home for me, filled with possibilities as it brings me emotionally closer to my colleagues. But, there's always a but. After 3 months of adjusting to each other as colleagues, I receive an email from the dean, who is now no longer acting, has been instituted as the dean, indicating that a colleague has complained about Jordan's presence in the department. I meet with her as a matter of urgency, as she advises in the email that he needs to be removed from the workplace. As we talk about the situation in our office, she confides that for professional reasons, inclusive of privacy and confidentiality, Jordan has to be removed. I look at her incredulously. Privacy and confidentiality. What is an 8-month-old going to reveal about colleagues and the conversations that they have with me as the head of department? He cannot speak at this point. So what is the actual concern? The dean says, I'm a feminist and I can understand your position, but in this matter, he has to be removed from office by the 1st of April. And this is round about the 26th of March. The culture, she says, isn't ready. With no recourse, and angered by a situation created through slavish adherence to rules that ignore the intersectional identities of workers, I blurt out the problem in a departmental meeting. The department is supportive and under the leadership of the previous acting head of department, a woman in her 60s at this point who has never had children. Okay. They craft a formal letter noting their concern with the content of the anonymous email and demand a further period of time to secure an appropriate daycare. The answer from the dean is a resounding no. And as we move closer to the 1st of April, I turn to the DVC of infrastructure nogal and appeal the dean's decision. He hears me out and shares stories of his personal struggle to secure his children's care during his career too. He approves my request to keep Jordan with me for 2 months further while I find the necessary daycare. Note, a man, not a woman. Okay? So in 2018, at the start of my tenure at the UFS, I was told that the culture wasn't ready to accept a mother and a child in the working environment. In 2020 and 2021, during our COVID years, compelled to work from home, work merged with home. My son did not complain about the intrusion into family life. Rather, he and I managed the daily process of meetings, supervision, responding to emails, taking calls, and online teaching as we solidified our relationship as mother and son. And during this period, Jordan was 2 and 3 years old. That the institution expected and even demanded this, while soft soaping us with HR videos on pivoting, resilience, and agility, confirmed to me at least that business as usual at whatever cost had to be maintained, and that cost would be carried by the individual, not the institution. But it also had an unintended consequence, and I think this is what life teaches us. It's neither either or. Yeah, somewhere in between, they are integrated experiences. And if we pay attention to both, we start to see the complexity of what is emerging as the African university. Okay. So these experiences further confirmed that the institutional culture, not static, that it can flex and mold to the various needs of those working in the institution. And that indeed, as suggested by Nyamjo in his discussion of frontier Africans, that we are incomplete, always evolving in relation to and as we encounter similar and dissimilar others. And like Beale's research participants in the asylum, we are unfinished human beings, acted upon even as we act on others. Our agency, depending on our intersectional placements in the academy, which includes our position, confirms our sphere of influence and direct impact. And at least within my personal praxis and ontological expression, disruption, transgression, and provocation are normative. As a biological mother who mothers in unexpected academic places, my office, my classroom, and at conferences like this one, I visualize the presence of women as mothers in the academy. My rank and position interrogate the foundations of the academy, where notions of professionalism are tied to stereotypically male characteristics, such as being objective, rational, effective, unemotional, organized, and punctual. I'm moving very quickly here. So in the end, I went through this very quickly. The academy and the higher education terrain in South Africa are emergent, unfinished, and incomplete. The landscape changes as those who enter the academy's halls create alternate ways of belonging through relating and relatedness. A microcosm for the larger society, our institutions create subtle shifts in thinking and being within our students, and they, in turn, impact those around them. We must never forget where our students come from. They go back and they take what we've taught them back to where they come from. Okay? So as Hooks noted 30 years ago, the academy is not paradise. Any young up-and-coming academic who thinks it is, sorry, it's not. I'm bursting your bubble. There's lots of work to do, and you are pushed to do that work because you are in the academy. You cannot take this for granted, okay? But learning is a place where paradise can be created. The academy, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that opportunity for freedom, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education as the practice of freedom. The photograph you see in front of you was 2 days ago when I was putting this presentation to bed, and I realized that this is really a picture of Jordan and me during COVID. I would be in the office and I'd be working, and at this point he's eaten, he's happy, he's not going to come and ask me, "Mum, I'm hungry." You know, we've also made sure that he's gone to the loo, because at least on 2-3 occasions while teaching online, he happily went running down the passage and shouted, "Mummy, I want to pee-pee." And all the students exploded with laughter. So I was learning how to navigate the teaching and the home space together. And inevitably, it would be me working from about 9 to 4, 4:30, with intermittent breaks where I'm attending to his needs. And then when I really need to focus, I would give him the phone and he would pay attention to that, right? So Did I ever think that this was going to be my life? No, because as long as I didn't have a child and I was a woman and I was accepting of a very masculine space, right? The assumption is that when you think you're being masculine, there was no problem. I had a womb, but I bore no fruit from that womb. And so in effect, I was a pseudo man. Yeah, I could look after my students. I could offer the pastoral care. They could call me mom, which they still do, quite strangely. And that was fine until I had a son who wasn't only an object, but a subject, and one that was tied to me physically, right? So when we talk about change and transformation, the agency we each carry has to be exercised. And in that way, we can inspire mass struggle. Okay, that's it. After that, you said something.
Thank you so much, Joy. I will now invite the speakers that have gone before and just for a quick Q&A. Yeah, if you can please come forward. Yeah. Thank you. I'll stand. We're just going to grab some chairs, have a quick Q&A, and then move on to lunch. So I hope to not be doing the talking. I hope that we are in discussion with one another, we're sharing, we're questioning, and we're asking. So I don't know if there are any questions, comments from the people in the room while we give people online a chance to just think and mull on it. Are there any questions or thoughts? Please come through. We do need you to come through to the mic. I'll try and bring it to you somehow.
Thank you, colleagues, for your presentations. As I was listening to each one of you, I was like imagining this Afrocentric university and what it means in reality. Because what we have just painted is actually the reality of it as we are at the moment. I'm just going to start with you, Pedro. You're using the metaphor of a womb. And when I think of a womb, I think of permanence. Because literally a womb is what a woman is born with. It's there, it's not going anywhere, whether it's fruitful or not, but it is there. And at the same time, if you look at the connotations of it, it's all about life, giving life and nurturing. And it's also the center of emotions because everything takes place there. I mean, even if you draw from a religious perspective, it says, I knew you before you were born, before you were formed in your mother's womb. So which means that is where the whole thing, actually starts. So what I would like maybe just for you to expand a little bit on that metaphor in the context of what I've just, I've defined. And then, and you, Ma'am Abongile, what you are raising is very important and it's quite challenging, not just in research, but in the culture of the institution. When you were presenting, I thought of an example. A student in our faculty actually had a trance in the middle of the class. And then I think it was not an African lecturer at that point. So they gave her water, to drink, and was taken to the bathroom to say, please do your thing there. We don't know. So it's very crucial. And the second aspect, I remember there was an interview You know, we go to interviews, you only focus on what the person is saying, but when somebody there says, listen, we can't take this candidate irrespective of the responses that the candidate has given because this is what I see. How do you then, you know, work around that? Because this is a reality on its own, not that in research, but maybe if you can have some ideas around the culture of the institution on our daily experiences and how we can deal with that issue. And then I was wondering if you're thinking, what is it, a mass theory? You know, if we can come together as a group, actually, I think it applies to all. And then when we reach that tipping point and the threshold, and we can actually influence all of this, because I feel all of these discussions is more like we are cleaning a house. You know, like when you have someone who helps you to clean a house, you come back from work, you realize it's not clean. It's like we're just doing the work and we move on. Not so long ago, okay, I'll talk about that later. We're busy decolonizing and then we were COVIDing and now, yeah. So maybe if you can just comment on that. And ma'am, the whole thing around text, we have an issue with regard to African languages and the text in our institutions. Anything around multilingualism and how it can be used, you know, for all of us, even students, to access that knowledge through text, but in languages that we understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll start with you, Pedro, if that's okay. Would you need some time? You know?
Thank you so much for the questions, Prof. Extremely difficult. The womb metaphor, it was me sitting and thinking that at the moment we have a university modeled around the factory. It's modeled around military conquest. The university is more of a museum of strategies that colonizers used to dismember and kill Africans, not just in Africa, but around the world. So the university at the moment is a terrain of racism. It's a terrain of dehumanization. Now transferring the possibility now of a university out of a womb is now me trying to say, can we now have a university born out of the human, out of the convictions of people? Because a womb is, it is inside a human being. It is inside a woman. And a womb is a source of power in our own African context. Because to give life, if I were to now use a religious doctrine, if God created human beings, then the woman now giving birth to human beings is actually performing the work of God on earth. You know, you are the source and the creator of life. So everything we see and breathe comes from a human being, and it is intended to make the human family conducive. So what I was trying to imagine, to think there is it possible to have a university born out of the convictions of being human? A university built out of what human beings actually do and how human beings actually live, you know? So I like the presentation that Ojoy made, extremely incredible, to show how barbaric the University of the Free State is, of not appreciating the human family that the person they have appointed is bringing. In other words, they do not They welcome your CV, but not the person, you know? And that is the problem with the Imperial University. The appreciation of artificial credentials over the humanity of the people who are coming to serve in this institution. So the womb, therefore, I was taking it in that context that an Afrocentric university would have to be a people-centered university. It has to be a university that prioritizes life, and it has to be a university that makes humanity the priority of all that is living on earth. At the moment, we have a university that is anti-human, anti-life, that is actively pursuing, you know, the destruction of Africans, women, workers, students, you name it. So that is how I used the metaphor of the womb.
Thank you so much. Once again, that is a very difficult question, not difficult, but challenging question. In another setting, I would say, let me just take it and put it in a freezer and let it marinate, but I will not do that today. But it reminds me of a conference that I went to at Rhodes University, where a student came in and she's in the anthropology department, and she was a Sangoma through and through. And the title of her research was "The Academic Space is Not Safe for Indigenous People." And she started by burning. Yes, what is it in English? She started burning impepo and to invoke her ancestors to be in that space. And there was a drum that was being beaten, kuku, 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 kuku. And the song that was saying, "Konjane, ngubani na lukulayo." I still remember. And as we were clapping, and she's just busy, like we are friends, and she's dancing, and her ancestors were coming in, not one by one and not even slowly. They were like coming into that space. And everybody in the space felt that she was owning the space. And the theme of that conference was, what was it? It was talking about the table. How do we rearrange the table or make everybody comfortable in the table? But she did not try to make anybody comfortable in the table. She took that table and she threw it away, because at the end of the day, when we sit in these tables, other people are sitting in comfortable chairs, but other people are sitting in those chairs that are meant for small children. So up until we take out this table that is problematic and throw it aside, and for other people to feel how it is like to be Black, or how it is like to be uncomfortable in that space, because a lot of people were uncomfortable. So we need to be in that space of being uncomfortable, in that space of seeing this is another person's reality, even though it makes me uncomfortable, but how do I live within that space? And not saying that, oh, just because she's going through a trance, a person's going through a trance, she must just, excuse us and deal with her issue and drink the water. But how do we become uncomfortable in that space with her and show up? So it is not an easy question to answer, and it's not a question that I can answer right now as one person, but I think it's a question that needs collaboration, that needs ubuntu, that needs all of us to put our heads together and be like, how can we be in this uncomfortable process?
Thank you, Prof, for that question. So yeah, I feel like I'm going to repeat what everyone said, because the question of multilingualism, especially at South African institutions, is a difficult one, because it's a conversation that has been happening forever. there are strides that are being made in policy, but that is not translating into action on the ground, especially at universities. And it's difficult because it needs people to act at various levels. So you need the student to be involved in it, to be interested in it. And looking at our basic education and the emphasis on the English language and the decentering of African languages in that context, then creates a situation where when you get into a university, even if you are a member of staff or just an individual who is interested in pushing this agenda, buy-in from the students is also difficult. So there's the student part, there's also the staff part of lecturers, and what are you investing in the space? How are you contributing to this project of multilingualism? Is it even something that people see as relevant? Especially with the presentation yesterday about this emphasis on globalization and internationalization. So there's also this question of what use does it serve for me to do research in isiXhosa or to do research in isiSotho or whatever indigenous language. And then there's the institution, and it's very difficult to get the institutions to come to the party. And so it just makes it so difficult to actually have it operationalized on a large scale. But something that I have learned, and I'm thankful for my supervisor for, is that he is passionate about isiXhosa. He loves isiXhosa, and even though it's not part of he's at GCT, multilingualism is not a thing there, but he gets into the classroom and he teaches multilingually, and he engages with students in languages that he knows. He speaks isiXhosa, he speaks English, he speaks Afrikaans, and he says in the classroom, if you understand me and you want to respond, but you don't want to respond in English or you feel you can't do it, and if I don't understand your language, surely there's someone who speaks isiSotho here who can translate for us so that everyone is included in the conversation. So something that I have taken, because I even took it into tutorials and all that, is, and just learning that at this point, the will inside people, whether it's staff, whether it's students, is very important to drive multilingualism in terms of communication and being able to communicate and hear each other and understand each other in the classroom. And then there's the whole part about the intellectual project in indigenous languages, because it's one thing to just communicate theory in our languages that already exists, but then how can we take it a step further and engage with content, engage with writing, community members in our own indigenous language and theorize from indigenous languages. So that is a whole other project as well. With the archives, limited access, a lot of people don't know about what is in the archive, what is available, how can you, as a sociologist, use theory or use literature, isiXhosa literature, to theorize in a sociological way. That's something that we need to grapple with, to go beyond just communication, but also theorizing in our indigenous languages with indigenous language content.
I think there are lots of thoughts going through my head while I'm listening, right? And so I'm also even wanting to respond to their commentary. I want to challenge you, Pedro, right? A womb doesn't only give birth to one. There could be multiples. Mine gave birth to one and I chose not to further because being a mom is difficult. So I take my hat off to those who have 2, 3, 4, 5, and are still in the academic space doing what you do. It is difficult work, right? So if you think of the womb as that nurturing space, and not only having given birth to imperialism, because if we want to talk about humanity as one, there are multiples coming from that womb. And those in power pay attention to one and support it in various ways. But that doesn't deny the existence of the others. Right? So maybe play around with that. You know, it's a challenging question. And why? I was teaching a development course at Rhodes University for 14 years, you know, and I thought I'd reached a point where I have to keep inspiring my students to ask these questions. Where do you come from? What does this look like? What does it look like on the African continent? Was Europe just developed, you know, or was it also underdeveloped? And so we're talking about Volpe and world systems, and I was pushing this group because, interestingly, at the time, we had a very diverse demographic at Rhodes. It wasn't 80% Black. It was 45% Black, 40% white, and then other, you know? And at the end of that course, a very progressive young man, white man, looked at me and he said, you know, Joy, why must we fix what you messed up? Why are you inspiring us to become that critical mass and to change things? What work have you done? And where are we missing each other? And as I've moved, I've started to realize we have to do it together. But how do we do that? Right? So the manner in which the system situates you as an associate prof, when I went, I was told, you like hanging out with the students. My PhD supervisor and previous head of department, and he says, you like hanging out with the students, you have to stop it, eh? Because now you've moved into a different rank and level. I didn't stop it. What's going on, right? And then colleagues started to feel irritated because how are you as head of department linked to students? How can you have this even joking relationship where you can understand them and you can ask them and you can push them, but there's the emotionality of it, so that when I'm in a Senate meeting or I'm in a faculty meeting and I say, stop referring to our students as if they are criminals, because at the start of the year, they want to access and they don't have funding. What are you doing, right? There are too few of us doing that. Too few of us. And often I think when you start out, you think, okay, one day when I get to that level, I'm going to do it. But then you look around you and you realize, but people at that level are scared. So that idea of, you know, everybody polices each other through silence. And then you say something and then an inbox comes. Well done for speaking for all of us. No, that's rubbish. Why didn't you then agree in the larger group? Why are you taking me aside and saying, I agree with you? So the manner in which we are kept busy as the academics, the research, the teaching, the supervision, we don't have time to connect with our students. We don't have time to say, you know what? If you guys decide that's it, you're protesting, we are also protesting. So instead of coming knocking on our doors while you're protesting and saying, everybody get out, why don't we say, right, here we are. We're sitting with you. Why do we feel like we're going to be targeted? So while I talk about the need for that critical mass and across the levels, I also understand how afraid people are. at every level because of that very thing. I used to tease my students and I used to say to them, why do you think I'm perpetuating the system? I like my salary. And they'd be like, yo, hey, look, check this woman. And I say, yeah, I also need to eat. I've been told I need to buy a house. So where do you think I'm going to get the money to purchase a house? So thank you very much for showing up because you're paying me. And they'd be like, what? And I'd say, be aware of how you've become complicit in the system that oppresses you. Because if you don't, you perpetuate it without creating the critical understanding. And if by being critical, you say, no, it's easier to be a part of it rather than fight it, I'll respect you. Because you've seen it for what it is, and you are recognizing your then I have deep respect. But it's hard, and I wish we were there. I think some of us in the social sciences and humanities, and a recent thing is now that social science and humanities, we're under attack. If you don't think so, we really are. Ne? And it's come to the South African higher education system. When you look at it, it's like everything that you've been a part of since 1993 as a student, as a tutor, as somebody working on the margins in administration, everything, you look at it and you go, really? Really? So you're going to tell me about development goals? Really? You're not going to contextualize it? Really? So now I'm starting to feel exhausted by it. And I supposedly have 15 years left. So I have to ask very seriously, what am I going to do in the next 15 years? Because then they'll say, bye-bye. So it's very hard conversations that we need, but then we need to create the relational networks where we start to say to each other, when you can add here, add. I'm taking a backseat because I need to do A, B, C, D, E, but I'm coming. Ne? So then you can say to me, now I'm tired. Can you please write that article? Here's a network of people. We actually, if we want to change it, we have to be strategic, because the individuals, our bosses, are there for 5 years, maximum 10. We are in the halls doing the work much longer than that. And so why are we actually accepting it?
Yeah, if I may, I know there are people who lunch is happening. So if you feel the hunger is too much and you need to go, please feel free. We won't judge you. We won't find you at lunch and ask you questions. Please feel free. But if you would like to continue, and I hope that's okay, if you'd like to continue sitting, engaging, please feel free. I'm also happy to continue. So if you get up, we don't mind. Thank you.
I just want to cover one more question that Prof asked that is not answered. And I also see the hand from Olozok. Why must we teach about mass struggle? We must teach mass struggle now to students and our peers that we come across, because racism does not listen. Patriarchy does not listen. All forces of oppression, they don't have ears, right? Like, you can be the best professor in the world where you tell white people that racism is a fabrication, it's wrong, it's invalid, it makes no sense. But do they stop being racist? They don't stop. They just continue doing the rubbish. So the only time systems of power get to listen, it's when there's mass action to dismantle those systems, right? You go to a university at the beginning of each year. People who run universities, they know students cannot study without food, without books, without funding. And students write emails to them. Don't start lectures, we don't have food. Don't start lectures, we don't have books. Do authorities in the university listen to them? No, they don't. They proceed to starting lectures. When do people in authority begin to listen to students? It's when students do what? When they take action and ban things and close down the university. So mass action is the only tool. It's proven across the history of Africa, the history of liberation struggles right across this continent. Colonial systems only listen to mass action. And by that time, it's when masses now are sick and tired of your rubbish, and they just want to take over now and begin to lead their own destiny. So whenever I teach students, I present all kinds of histories and theories to them, but I always end up by saying, mass struggle is going to be the ones that is going to deliver this destination that we're heading to. So what Abongile and Uzimi are saying, clearly, from the fieldwork they've done, people have knowledge, people have thought, people have philosophies. In fact, some of the things that you came across in your fieldwork, you realize that there are people here who think far more greater than these professors in the Western University. But the Western University is so arrogant to say, no, 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 no. We are the only ones with knowledge. Imagine telling the whole community of Kampala that knowledge is only in this yard of Makerere, and everywhere else outside Makerere, there's no knowledge. You must be sick if you think like that. There's something wrong with you, right? So universities steal knowledge from communities, and then they prescribe authority over that knowledge. Yet there are people out there who know far better than the people who are in these four corners of the university. Then lastly, the womb is a political terrain. It's a very sensitive political place. Women who can't give birth, they are labeled as being dysfunctional, right? Women who do give birth, they don't get promotions at work. They are pushed to reproductive labor with cheap wages. They have little opportunities of social mobility, right? So in other words, if you don't give birth, you are in trouble. If you do give birth, you are also in trouble. So the problem essentially is hierarchy that is surrounding this thing called a womb, where there's just political contestations around. So part of the decolonial framework is to actually recenter what it actually is, right? It gives birth to life. It gives birth to humanity. Look, no parent wants to give birth to a gangster, or a criminal. All of us, we pray that our children will become good, productive people. But the reality of the world we live in is there are unfortunate human beings who will fall victims to these social relations we have in the world, and they end up becoming criminals. They end up becoming imperialists. They end up becoming racists. And they give us no option, but we have to fight against them, But at the end of the day, the intention of this organ in our human beings was for it to give birth to the beauty of human. I wish we had more time. I wanted to listen to Abongile, Zimi, and Joy even more. They were brilliant presentations. Yeah, I just wanted to answer that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for one very quick question and then hopefully a very quick response.
Yeah, thanks. It is said it must be quick when it's me speaking. That is very intimidating and silencing. But I don't want to stand before lunch, in between lunch and people, but quick ones. Then we can even take the discussion outside. The first one, in what Asipe was saying, Abongile Mansori, Abongile was saying on, and using your question, is the world ready? Is the world ready, or is humanity ready? Or is culture ready? Is the culture ready? In your story on Yandiswa, you said you had to dig in and speak to her ancestors who interact with her and tell her, but you did, of course, had ethical permission for that. Now, I'm trying to wonder if a research that can be based on spirituality, if our universities are ready to have that pass through the ethical clearance process. Because I think that is when we'll be starting to speak about an Afrocentric university. Have you tried that? Because I was actually interested to know if indeed, if you had tried that, what would have happened? If we had, if in other scenarios, ever considered that. The other point to use in the early writers, African scholars, those guys translated the Bible. They wrote in isiXhosa. They were strong on African languages. Now, this is a comment. Now, in my view, it seems as if there was a break somewhere during the politics for the struggle for resistance and taking over the nation state and so on. And the focus was that state power, not Africanization, not dismantling the cultural base of colonialism, which was happening before with the early writers. Now, so this is basically my view. It is only being reborn now, recently. So I call that period a lull in terms of Africanization, the liberation eras. Now, the last point for a debate between the two of you guys, Pedro and Joy. No, Joy, this was not the core of your presentation, but you mentioned it. You said your mom was apolitical. Now, I want to challenge you on that, basing what Pedro was presenting about is existential philosophy. Now, can a woman in South Africa under apartheid, bringing up children or a child in such a situation be referred to as apolitical within the context of also, I will need a comment from Pedro, can even be outside of the session, within the context of our struggles, our politics and our ideas and our philosophy. So we don't need to be in lecture rooms or don't need to chant slogans to be in a way political. So those are my points. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to everyone in the room and those online. Thank you for joining us. We'll head off to lunch. Thank you, everyone.